A debt long remembered. France, 1918. Nurse Evelyn Carter sat beside Captain James Calloway, watching over him as he slept. He had been unconscious for days. Then, suddenly, he whispered, "Evelyn, don't open the letter." Her heart pounded. She had received no letter. But when she returned to her cot, an envelope lay waiting addressed in his handwriting. Chapter 1. The Whispers of a Sleeping Soldier. The air in the field hospital hung thick with the cloying sweetness of antiseptic, battling the underlying stench of blood and decay. Evelyn Carter, her starched white uniform somehow still pristine despite the ceaseless chaos, gently dabbed a cool cloth across Captain James Calloway's brow. He was a study in contrasts, a rugged, handsome face marred by a jagged scar that traced a path from his temple to his jaw, framed by dark, unruly hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. His strong hands, now lying limp at his sides, were calloused and bore the ingrained grime of the trenches. He'd been unconscious for 3 days, a victim of a shell blast that had miraculously spared his life, but stolen his awareness. Evelyn had seen countless men succumb to their injuries in this makeshift hospital, a converted church just miles from the front lines near Amiens. The stained glass windows, depicting scenes of serene saints and biblical miracles, were incongruous with the rows of cots filled with broken bodies. The constant drone of artillery fire, a dull, rhythmic thudding, vibrated through the floor, a constant reminder of the war raging just beyond the sandbagged walls. Yet, Captain Calloway clung to life, a stubborn ember refusing to be extinguished. She'd grown accustomed to the sounds of suffering, the moans, the cries, the ragged breathing of men fighting their last battles. But Captain Calloway had been silent, a still point in the swirling storm of the ward. Evelyn found herself drawn to him, not just as a patient, but as a puzzle. His file, which she'd read more times than necessary, painted a picture of a decorated officer, a man of unwavering courage and strategic brilliance. A man from a good family, a respected lineage. But there were gaps, omissions that hinted at a life beyond the military accolades. A life, perhaps, he wanted to keep hidden. She adjusted the thin blanket covering him, her fingers brushing against his arm. His skin was surprisingly warm, a testament to the life force still coursing through him. He was a physically imposing man, even in his weakened state. Broad shoulders strained against the thin cotton of his hospital gown, and the faint stubble shadowing his jaw only emphasized the sharp angles of his face. He was a man built for action, for command, not for lying helpless in a hospital bed. Hours blurred into a monotonous routine of checking vitals, changing dressings, and offering comfort to men who were often beyond comforting. The other nurses, seasoned veterans of the war's relentless toll, moved with a weary efficiency, their faces etched with a mixture of compassion and resignation. Evelyn, though only 28, felt older than her years. The war had stolen her innocence, her naivety, replacing it with a grim understanding of the fragility of life. It was during the quietest hour, just before dawn, when the shelling had momentarily subsided, that it happened. Captain Calloway stirred, his eyelids fluttering. Evelyn leaned closer, her heart quickening with a mixture of hope and trepidation. He mumbled something, unintelligible at first. Then, his voice, raspy but clear, cut through the silence. "Evelyn, don't open the letter." Her breath caught in her throat. Her name. He knew her name. But how? She'd spoken to him, of course, whispered words of encouragement, of reassurance, as she tended to him. But he'd never responded, never shown any sign of hearing her. And the letter, what letter? She hadn't received any letters. Her correspondence was limited to brief, censored notes to her parents in England, assuring them of her safety, a lie she repeated with each carefully worded sentence. He shifted again, his brow furrowed in a frown, as if wrestling with some unseen demon. His hand clenched into a fist. Then, just as suddenly as he'd spoken, he fell silent again, slipping back into the depths of unconsciousness. Evelyn sat frozen, his words echoing in her mind. Don't open the letter. It was absurd. A delirious rambling. Nothing more. Yet, A prickle of unease ran down her spine. She glanced at the other patients, their faces pale and drawn in the dim light filtering through the high, arched windows. None of them seemed to have noticed the captain's brief awakening. She rose, her legs stiff from hours of sitting. She needed to check on the other patients, to busy herself with the mundane tasks of her duty. But the captain's words, his unexpected utterance of her name, had unsettled her. It was as if a hidden door had creaked open, revealing a glimpse of something unknown, something unsettling. Later, after completing her rounds, she returned to her small, cramped quarters, a tiny room partitioned off from the main ward. It contained little more than a narrow cot, a small wooden chest for her belongings, and a wash basin. A single candle flickered on a makeshift table, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of mildew. She sat on the edge of her cot, feeling a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. The captain's words replayed in her mind, a persistent whisper that refused to be ignored. She reached for her worn leather satchel, where she kept her few personal possessions: a small, silver-framed photograph of her parents, a worn copy of Persuasion, and a handful of letters from home. As she rummaged through the bag, her fingers brushed against something unexpected: a crisp, white envelope tucked beneath her book. Her heart skipped a beat. She pulled it out, her hand trembling slightly. It was addressed to her, in a bold, unfamiliar handwriting. A handwriting that, with a sudden jolt of recognition, she realized was strikingly similar to the signature she'd seen on Captain Calloway's medical chart. She stared at the envelope, her mind racing. It couldn't be. It was impossible. He'd been unconscious. He couldn't have written a letter, let alone delivered it to her. Yet there it was, a tangible object that defied all logic, all reason. The candle flame flickered, casting the room into momentary darkness, then flared again, illuminating the stark white of the envelope, the elegant script of her name. A chilling premonition, a sense of foreboding, washed over her. She knew, with a certainty that defied explanation, that this letter, this impossible letter, was the one Captain Calloway had warned her not to open. The one he had spoken of in his sleep. But why? Chapter 2. The Letter and the Unsent Message. Evelyn's fingers hovered over the sealed flap of the envelope. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the backdrop of distant artillery fire. The candle on her makeshift table sputtered, casting elongated, dancing shadows that seemed to mock her indecision. The room, normally a sanctuary of quiet solitude, felt suddenly claustrophobic, the air thick with unspoken questions. The rational part of her mind screamed that it was a coincidence, a cruel trick of fate. Perhaps another patient, another Calloway, had written it. Perhaps it was a misdelivered piece of mail, a common occurrence in the chaotic environment of a war. But the seed of doubt, planted by the sleeping captain's whispered warning, had taken root, growing into a vine of unease that constricted her chest. She traced the elegant script of her name, the loops and swirls of the handwriting strangely familiar, yet utterly foreign. It was a man's handwriting, strong and decisive, yet with a hint of vulnerability. She couldn't explain it, but the script itself seemed to pulse with a hidden energy, a silent plea. She glanced at the small, cracked mirror hanging above her wash basin. Her reflection stared back at her, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. Her brown hair, usually neatly pinned beneath her cap, had come loose, framing her face in a cloud of soft curls. She looked younger than her 28 years, more vulnerable, less the hardened war nurse she had become. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself. She was a nurse, a woman of science and reason. She wouldn't be swayed by superstitious fears, by the ramblings of a delirious man. She would open the letter, read its contents, and dispel this irrational anxiety. With trembling fingers, she carefully broke the seal. The paper was thick and expensive, not the flimsy, ration paper used for most wartime correspondence. It smelled faintly of sandalwood, a scent that conjured images of a life far removed from the mud and blood of the trenches. She unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the neatly written words. My dearest Evelyn, if you are reading this, then I have failed. I have failed in my mission, and I have failed you. I know this is not how we were meant to meet, not through a letter written in the shadow of death. But time, as always, is the enemy. There are things you do not know, things I cannot fully explain, even now. I am bound by oaths, by duties that transcend personal desires. But know this, Evelyn. You are in danger. The very air you breathe is poisoned by deceit. Trust no one, especially those who claim to be your allies. I had hoped to tell you everything in person, to explain the tangled web of secrets that has ensnared us both. But fate, it seems, has other plans. I can only pray that this letter reaches you in time, that it can offer you some small measure of protection. There is a code, a message hidden within this letter. Look for the words that are out of place, the phrases that seem incongruous. They will lead you to the truth, to the one person you can trust. But be warned, Evelyn, the path is fraught with peril. The enemy is closer than you think. I know I am asking much of you, a woman I have never met, yet feel I have known for a lifetime. But I believe in you, Evelyn. I believe in your strength, your courage, your unwavering spirit. You are the key, the only one who can unlock the truth and prevent a catastrophe. With all my love and a hope that will never die, James Calloway. Evelyn read the letter again, and then again, her mind reeling. The words were both cryptic and terrifying. A mission?
Danger? Deceit?
It sounded like something out of a penny dreadful, not the reality of her life as a war nurse. Yet, the sincerity in the writing, the palpable sense of urgency, could not be dismissed. She examined the letter more closely, searching for the words that are out of place, the phrases that seem incongruous. It was like trying to solve a riddle in a nightmare. The language was formal, almost stilted, yet there were moments of intense emotion, flashes of a man wrestling with his conscience, with his duty, with his love. The phrase "a hope that will never die" struck her. It was a bold declaration, a testament to a connection that defied logic, that transcended the physical separation between them. How could a man she had never met, a man who had been unconscious for days, write such a letter? She noticed a slight variation in the ink in certain words. It wasn't obvious, a subtle shift in shade, almost imperceptible. She held the letter closer to the candle, squinting at the text. The words failed: time, oaths, allies, secrets, peril, truth, and key appeared to be written with a slightly darker ink. Could this be the code? A sudden pounding on her door startled her. She quickly folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket, her heart racing. Nurse Carter? Are you all right? It was Nurse Davies, her voice muffled through the thin wooden door. Yes, I'm fine, Evelyn replied, trying to keep her voice steady.
Just a bad dream. All right.
Just checking. The shelling's getting worse again. I'll be out in a moment, Evelyn said. She waited until Nurse Davies' footsteps faded away before retrieving the letter. She needed time to decipher the code, to understand the meaning of Captain Calloway's words. But time, as he had written, was the enemy. As she was putting the letter safely back into her satchel, she pulled out her small notepad. She often wrote down her thoughts and dreams, trying to hold on to sanity on the edge of a world gone mad. It fell open to the last page. There, scrawled in her own handwriting, was a short entry from 3 nights before. Dreamed of a soldier. A captain. He was speaking, but I couldn't hear him. He seemed desperate. He kept repeating a word. Or was it a name? It sounded like Calloway. Strange. Evelyn stared at the entry, a chill running down her spine. She had written this before Captain Calloway had been brought to the hospital, before she had even known his name. The dream, the letter, the whispered warning, it was all connected, intertwined in a way she couldn't yet comprehend. And she was right in the middle of it. She had a growing fear about what she'd find. Chapter 3. Shadows of Amiens. The shelling intensified, shaking the very foundations of the converted church. The air, already thick with the smell of antiseptic and fear, grew heavy with dust dislodged from the ancient stone walls. Evelyn, her starched uniform a stark contrast to the grime and chaos around her, moved through the ward with a practiced efficiency, her internal turmoil masked by a facade of calm professionalism. Each explosion sent tremors through the rows of cots, causing the wounded men to stir and moan. Some cried out in pain, others in fear, their voices blending into a symphony of suffering that echoed through the vaulted ceiling. Evelyn paused beside a young soldier, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with terror. She gently placed a hand on his forehead, offering a reassuring smile. "It's all right, son," she murmured, her voice calm and steady. "Just a bit of thunder. It will pass." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. The thunder of artillery fire was a constant presence, a reminder of the brutal reality that lay just beyond the sandbagged walls of the hospital. It was a thunder that might never pass, a storm that threatened to consume them all. She continued her rounds, checking bandages, administering medication, offering words of comfort where she could. But her mind was elsewhere, consumed by the cryptic message contained within Captain Calloway's letter. The words he had highlighted failed: time, oaths, allies, secrets, peril, truth. Keys swirled in her thoughts, a jumble of disconnected fragments that refused to form a coherent whole. She glanced at Captain Calloway's cot. He remained unconscious, his breathing shallow but regular. His face, normally strong and resolute, was now slack and vulnerable. The scar that bisected his cheek seemed to stand out more prominently in the dim light, a stark reminder of the violence he had endured. She wondered about his mission, the oaths he had spoken of. What was he involved in? What secrets did he hold? And why had he chosen her, a complete stranger, to be the recipient of his cryptic message? The questions piled up, unanswered, adding to her growing sense of unease. As she reached the end of the ward, she encountered Nurse Davies, her face grim, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "Another convoy coming in, Evelyn," she said, her voice weary. "Mostly shell shock. They're saying the Germans are pushing hard near Amiens."
Amiens.
The name sent a shiver down Evelyn's spine. It was the city closest to the front lines, a strategic hub that both sides were desperately fighting to control. If Amiens fell, the consequences would be catastrophic. "I'll be ready," Evelyn replied, her voice betraying none of the inner turmoil she felt. The new arrivals were a harrowing sight. Men, their faces contorted with terror, their bodies trembling uncontrollably, were carried in on stretchers. Some were mute, their eyes staring blankly ahead, lost in a world of private horrors. Others babbled incoherently, reliving the trauma of the battlefield. Evelyn worked tirelessly alongside the other nurses and doctors to triage the wounded, to offer what little comfort they could. The air was filled with the cries of the injured, the frantic shouts of the medical staff, the relentless pounding of artillery fire. As she was tending to a young soldier, his uniform torn and bloodstained, his eyes glazed with shock, she overheard a snatch of conversation between two orderlies. "Heard they caught a spy just outside Amiens," one of them said, his voice low. "Working for the Germans, they say. Passing information about troop movements." "Bloody traitor," the other replied, spitting on the floor. "Hope they string him up."
A spy.
The word resonated with the warning in Captain Calloway's letter: trust no one, especially those who claim to be your allies. Could the spy be connected to his mission? Was this the danger he had spoken of? The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through Evelyn. She realized that she was caught in a web of intrigue far more complex and dangerous than she could have ever imagined. She was no longer just a nurse tending to the wounded, she was a player in a deadly game. A game where the stakes were far higher than she had ever anticipated. As the day wore on, the shelling gradually subsided, replaced by an eerie silence. The wounded were settled, their cries and moans fading into a low hum of pain and exhaustion. Evelyn, her body aching, her mind numb, found herself drawn back to Captain Calloway's cot. She sat beside him, watching his chest rise and fall with each shallow breath. He seemed to be sleeping peacefully, his face relaxed, his features softened. She reached out and gently touched his hand. His skin was warm, surprisingly so. She wondered what he would say if he were awake. What would he tell her about his mission, about the secrets he carried? And why had he chosen her, a complete stranger, to be his confidant? It felt like a burden, a heavy weight she did not ask for. As she sat there, lost in her thoughts, a sudden sound startled her. A soft whisper, barely audible above the quiet hum of the ward. Evelyn, it was Captain Calloway. His eyes were still closed, but his lips were moving. The clock, he whispered, his voice strained. The clock in the square then, just as suddenly as he had spoken. He fell silent again, his body still, his breathing regular. Evelyn stared at him, her heart pounding. The clock in the square. What did it mean? Was it another clue, another piece of the puzzle? She needed to see this clock. It was drawing her nearer. Chapter 4. The Promise Between Shells. The square could only mean one thing in this war-ravaged landscape. The place Gambetta, the central square of Amiens. Before the war, it had been a bustling hub of activity, surrounded by shops, cafes, and the imposing Hôtel de Ville. Now, Evelyn knew, it was likely a shell-pocked ruin, a desolate testament to the destructive power of modern warfare. Getting to Amiens was a perilous undertaking. The city was under constant threat of bombardment, and the roads leading to it were choked with military traffic and fleeing refugees. Civilians were strictly forbidden from entering the restricted zone, and even nurses were subject to rigorous scrutiny and questioning. But Evelyn was determined. Captain Calloway's whispered words, the clock in the square, echoed in her mind, a persistent summons she couldn't ignore. She felt a growing conviction that the clock held a vital clue, a key to understanding his mission and the danger he had warned her about. She knew she couldn't simply abandon her duties. The hospital was overwhelmed with wounded, and every nurse was needed. She would have to find a way to slip away, to make the journey to Amiens and back without raising suspicion. The opportunity presented itself sooner than she expected. A supply convoy was scheduled to depart for a forward aid station closer to Amiens, carrying medical supplies and a handful of wounded officers being transferred for further treatment. Evelyn volunteered to accompany the convoy, citing her experience with shell shock patients, a skill that was in high demand. Her request was initially met with resistance. The head doctor, a gruff, battle-hardened veteran, was reluctant to risk losing another nurse to the dangers of the front lines. But Evelyn persisted, arguing that her expertise could be crucial in stabilizing the traumatized officers during the journey. Finally, with a weary sigh, he relented. "All right, Carter," he said, his voice grudging.
But you stick with the convoy. No detours. No heroics.
You get those officers to the aid station, and you come straight back. Understood? Yes, sir, Evelyn replied, her voice firm, betraying none of the trepidation she felt. The journey was harrowing. The convoy, consisting of a handful of trucks and ambulances, lumbered along rutted, shell-pocked roads, the constant threat of enemy fire hanging heavy in the air. The sky was a leaden gray, the air thick with the acrid smell of cordite. Evelyn sat in the back of an ambulance, tending to a young officer who was suffering from severe shell shock. He trembled uncontrollably, his eyes wide with terror, his mind trapped in a nightmare of exploding shells and screaming men. She spoke to him in soothing tones, offering words of comfort, trying to distract him from the horrors he had witnessed. As they approached Amiens, the devastation became more apparent. Buildings were reduced to rubble, trees were stripped bare, the landscape a desolate wasteland of mud and craters. The air was filled with the sounds of war, the distant rumble of artillery, the crackle of gunfire, the occasional scream of a diving plane. When they reached the forward aid station, a makeshift collection of tents and dugouts just outside the city limits, Evelyn helped unload the wounded officers and ensured they were settled. She then informed the commanding officer that she needed to retrieve some specialized medical supplies from the main hospital in Amiens, a lie she had carefully concocted. The officer, preoccupied with the constant influx of casualties, waved her off with a dismissive gesture. "Be quick about it, nurse," he said, "and stay out of trouble." Evelyn slipped away from the aid station, her heart pounding. She knew she was taking a huge risk, but the pull of the clock, the urgency of Captain Calloway's whispered words, propelled her forward. She made her way towards the city center, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the main thoroughfares. The streets were eerily deserted, the silence broken only by the occasional burst of gunfire or the distant wail of an air raid siren. As she approached the Place Gambetta, she saw it. The clock. It was mounted on the surviving wall of the Hotel de Ville, its face cracked and damaged, its hands frozen at 3:15. It was a poignant symbol of a life interrupted, a time stopped. She stood there for a moment, gazing at the clock, her mind racing. What was she looking for? What clue did it hold? She examined the clock face, the surrounding walls, the rubble-strewn square. There was nothing, no obvious sign, no message. Disappointment washed over her. Had she risked everything for nothing? Was Captain Calloway's message simply the delusion of a dying man? Then she saw it. A small, almost imperceptible inscription carved into the stone beneath the clock. It was barely visible, obscured by grime and damage. She knelt down, brushing away the debris with her hand. The inscription was in Latin, Sub umbra horologi, veritas latet. Beneath the shadow of the clock, the truth hides. Evelyn's heart leaped. It was a clue. But what did it mean? The shadow of the clock at what time? The hands were frozen at 3:15. Was that significant? As she pondered the inscription, she heard a noise behind her. A footstep, the crunch of gravel. She whirled around, her heart in her throat. A figure emerged from the shadows. A man, tall and imposing, wearing the uniform of a British officer. He was silhouetted against the fading light, his face obscured. But as he drew closer, she recognized him. It was Captain James Calloway.
He was standing. He was alive.
He looked at her, a flicker of surprise, then a slow smile spread across his face. "Evelyn," he said, his voice no longer a whisper, but strong and clear. "You found it. You opened the letter after all." "But you were," she stammered, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. He gave her a look that changed her. "Unconscious? A necessary deception, I assure you," he said, taking a step closer. "But not anymore." He reached a gloved hand out toward her.
"There isn't much time," he said.
And before she could speak, he made a quiet, firm vow. "I promise I will explain everything. But first we must get away. We are not safe here, especially together." Chapter 5. The Spy Among Us. Evelyn stared at him, speechless, her mind struggling to reconcile the image of the unconscious, wounded soldier in the hospital bed with the vital, alert man standing before her. He was even more imposing in person, his presence filling the desolate square. The scar on his cheek, rather than detracting from his appearance, seemed to add a touch of rugged intensity to his handsome features. "But how?" She finally managed to stammer, her voice barely a whisper. "The letter you were I don't understand." "Calloway James," she corrected herself. The name feeling strangely intimate on her tongue gave a wry smile. "It's a long story, Evelyn, and one I promise to share with you in full. But not here.
Not now.
We're being watched." His words sent a chill down her spine. She glanced around the square, her eyes scanning the shadows, the ruined buildings. The eerie silence, which had moments before seemed merely unsettling, now felt menacing, pregnant with unseen danger. "Who?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Who's watching us?" "Someone who doesn't want us to meet," James replied, his voice low and urgent. "Someone who knows about the letter, about the information I possess." He paused, his gaze sweeping the square. "We need to move."
Quickly.
He took her arm, his grip firm but gentle. She didn't resist, her instincts telling her to trust him, despite the bewildering circumstances. He led her away from the clock, towards a narrow alleyway that snaked between two bombed-out buildings. "The hospital," Evelyn began, her thoughts returning to her duties, to the wounded men who depended on her. "I know," James interrupted, his voice tight. "It was a calculated risk. I needed to know if the letter had reached you, if you were receptive." He glanced at her, his eyes searching hers. "I had to be sure I could trust you." Trust me? Evelyn echoed, a flicker of indignation rising within her. You're the one who's been lying unconscious for days, leaving cryptic messages a necessary precaution, James insisted. I'm involved in sensitive work, Evelyn. Intelligence gathering. There's a spy, a highly placed informant, working within our own ranks. They're passing vital information to the Germans, compromising our operations, costing lives. The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Evelyn remembered the conversation she had overheard between the orderlies, the rumor of a spy caught near Amiens. Could it be connected? And you know who it is? She asked, her voice hushed. James nodded grimly. I have evidence. Proof. But I can't expose them without risking my own life and potentially jeopardizing a much larger operation. An operation that could turn the tide of the war. They reached the end of the alleyway, emerging onto a deserted street. The ruins of buildings loomed on either side, casting long, distorted shadows in the fading light. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. The clock, Evelyn began, remembering the inscription. Sub umbra horologi, veritas latet. What does it mean? It's a rendezvous point, James explained. A place where I was supposed to meet my contact, the person who was going to help me expose the spy. But they never showed. I suspect they were compromised. And the time? 3:15? James shook his head.
Not the time. The date.
March 15th. It's a code. A reference to a specific document. A list of names. The spy's name is on that list. Where is the list? Evelyn asked, her mind racing. That's what I need to find out, James replied. My contact was supposed to have it, but now I don't know where it is. Or who to trust. He looked at her, his eyes intense. That's why I needed you, Evelyn. You're outside the network, untainted. You're my only hope. His words, his trust, filled her with a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. She, a simple war nurse, was now entrusted with a secret that could potentially change the course of the war. It was a burden, a responsibility she hadn't asked for, but one she couldn't ignore. Suddenly, a sharp whistle pierced the silence. James instantly pulled Evelyn into the shadow of a doorway, his body shielding hers. Stay down, he whispered, his voice urgent. It's a patrol. German, I think. Evelyn held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs. She could hear the sound of boots approaching, the guttural voices of the soldiers. The danger was real, immediate. They waited, huddled in the darkness, until the patrol passed. James slowly raised his head, peering cautiously around the corner. All clear, he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. But we need to get out of here.
Now.
He looked down at her, and the faintest hint of worry crossed his features. He had exposed her. Now she was in as much danger as he was. The spy was still among them, and closer than either of them knew. Chapter 6. A dance of deception and desire. The escape from Amiens was a blur of hurried movements, whispered warnings, and heart-stopping moments of near discovery. James, with his intimate knowledge of the city's backstreets and alleyways, guided Evelyn through a labyrinth of ruined buildings and deserted streets, always staying one step ahead of the patrolling soldiers. He moved with a confidence and agility that belied his recent confinement, his senses honed, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Evelyn, struggling to keep up, marveled at his transformation. The man she had known as a silent, vulnerable patient was now a resourceful, decisive operative, a man clearly accustomed to danger and deception. As they navigated the war-torn city, James explained his plan. He had arranged for a safe house, a small, unassuming cottage on the outskirts of Amiens, where they could lie low and regroup. It was a place known only to a handful of trusted contacts, a refuge from the prying eyes of both the enemy and his own treacherous colleagues. We need to get to the safe house, assess the situation, and figure out our next move, he said, his voice low and urgent. They'll list the document with the spy's name. It's still out there. And we need to find it before they do. Evelyn nodded, her mind racing. She was still struggling to process everything that had happened, the sudden shift from the familiar routine of the hospital to the perilous world of espionage. But she knew she had to trust James, to rely on his expertise and his instincts. As they moved, a strange dynamic began to develop between them. The shared danger, the forced intimacy of their flight, created a bond, a connection that transcended the circumstances. They were two strangers, thrown together by fate, forced to rely on each other for survival. And yet there was something more, a spark, an undeniable attraction that simmered beneath the surface of their urgent mission. Evelyn found herself stealing glances at James, admiring his strength, his resilience, the way his eyes, normally sharp and alert, softened when they met hers. He, in turn, seemed to be equally aware of her. He would occasionally brush against her, his hand lingering on her arm, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. He would offer her a reassuring smile, a silent acknowledgement of their shared plight, a promise of protection. They reached the safe house just as dawn was breaking. It was a small, nondescript cottage, tucked away behind a screen of overgrown trees. The windows were boarded up, the garden neglected, giving it the appearance of abandonment. James produced a key from his pocket, unlocking the door with a quiet click. He ushered Evelyn inside, then quickly secured the door behind them. The interior was dark and dusty, the air thick with the smell of disuse. But it was safe, a haven from the dangers of the outside world. James lit a small oil lamp, casting a warm, flickering glow that illuminated the room. It was sparsely furnished, with a small table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, and a fireplace filled with cold ashes. But it was clean, and there were signs of recent habitation, a half-empty bottle of wine on the table, a stack of blankets on the bed, a few books on a shelf. "It's not much," James said, his voice apologetic, "but it's secure. We should be safe here for a while." Evelyn nodded, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. She felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, the adrenaline that had fueled her flight now receding. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "For everything." James met her gaze, his eyes searching hers. He seemed about to say something, then hesitated, his expression shifting. He looked away, running a hand through his dark hair. "We need to talk," he said, his voice serious. "About the letter, about the spy, about what we're going to do." He sat down at the table, gesturing for Evelyn to join him. She sat opposite him, the flickering lamplight casting dancing shadows on their faces. He began to explain, filling in the gaps in his story, revealing the details of his mission. He was a member of a covert intelligence unit, tasked with identifying and neutralizing enemy spies operating within the British ranks. He had been working undercover for months, gathering evidence, building a case against a highly placed individual who was betraying vital secrets to the Germans. The clock, the inscription, it was a pre-arranged signal, he explained. My contact was supposed to leave the document, the list of names, hidden somewhere near the clock. But they never showed. I suspect they were compromised. Either captured or killed. "And you think the spy knows about you?" Evelyn asked, her voice hushed. James nodded grimly. "They know someone is on their trail. They're getting desperate. That's why they're stepping up their efforts, leaking more information, causing more damage." He paused, his gaze intense. "And that's why they're looking for me. And now for you." He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. His fingers were warm and strong, his grip reassuring. "I never intended to involve you, Evelyn," he said, his voice soft. "But you're in this now. And I need your help." He hesitated, then added, "I won't let anything happen to you. I swear it. And soon, this dance, all the lies, all the hiding, will be over. One way or another." Chapter 7. The Cost of a Stolen Kiss. The weight of his words, the intensity of his gaze, sent a shiver through Evelyn. She looked down at their joined hands, his fingers intertwined with hers, a tangible connection in a world of uncertainty and danger. The small, safe room, lit only by the flickering oil lamp, felt suddenly intimate, charged with unspoken emotions. What can I do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze still fixed on their hands. James squeezed her hand gently, his thumb tracing a slow circle on her palm. You've already done more than you know, he said, his voice low and husky. You found the inscription. You came to Amiens. You trusted me, despite everything. He lifted his gaze to meet hers, his eyes dark and intense. That's more than I could have asked for. He paused, his expression shifting, a flicker of vulnerability crossing his features. I need you to be my eyes and ears, he continued, his voice serious again. To help me find the list, to expose the spy before it's too late. He explained his plan. He believed the list was still somewhere in Amiens, hidden by his contact before they were compromised. He had a few leads, a few possible locations, but he couldn't investigate them himself without risking exposure. I need you to go back to the hospital, he said, his voice reluctant. To act as if nothing has happened. To gather information, to listen for any rumors, any whispers, anything that might lead us to the list. The thought of returning to the hospital, to the familiar routine of her duties, filled Evelyn with a strange mix of relief and trepidation. Relief at the prospect of returning to something familiar, something safe. Trepidation at the thought of facing the danger alone, of playing the role of a spy. But what if they suspect me? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. What if the spy knows I was with you? James shook his head. They won't. Not yet. They'll be looking for me, not you. You're just a nurse, a nobody. You're beneath their notice. His words, though meant to be reassuring, stung. She wasn't just a nurse, a nobody. She was a woman who had risked her life to help him, a woman who was now caught up in a deadly game of espionage. But she understood the necessity of his plan. She had to be strong, to be brave, to play her part. She had to do it for him, for the men fighting on the front lines, for the hope of ending the war. All right, she said, her voice firm, her resolve hardening. I'll do it. I'll go back to the hospital, and I'll find the list. James smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his face, transforming him from the hardened operative into a man of warmth and charm. I knew I could count on you, Evelyn, he said, his voice soft. He leaned closer, his eyes fixed on hers, his gaze intense. The distance between them seemed to shrink, the air crackling with unspoken desire. The flickering lamplight cast dancing shadows on their faces, highlighting the curve of her lips, the intensity of his gaze. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hand, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. His touch was electric, sending a wave of heat through her. She closed her eyes, savoring the moment, the intimacy, the forbidden thrill. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tentative kiss. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated emotion, a connection that transcended the danger, the deception, the war that raged around them. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more passionate. It was a release of pent-up emotions, a desperate embrace in a world of uncertainty. It was a promise, a vow, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them. Suddenly, a loud crash from outside shattered the moment. James pulled away instantly, his senses alert, his body tensed. He grabbed a pistol from his belt, his eyes scanning the boarded-up windows. Stay here, he whispered, his voice urgent. Don't move. He crept towards the door, his movements silent and fluid. He peered through a crack in the boards, his eyes narrowed, his body poised for action. Evelyn held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs. The kiss, the moment of intimacy, seemed a distant memory, replaced by the harsh reality of their situation. The danger was real, immediate. James slowly lowered his pistol, his body relaxing slightly. He turned back to Evelyn, his expression grim. It was just a cat, he said, his voice strained. But it's a reminder. We're not safe. Not anywhere. He ran a hand through his hair. That brief moment of closeness, of a promise of something more, had almost cost them dearly. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and determination. We need to be more careful, he said, his voice low. We can't afford any more distractions. His eyes lingered on hers for one brief moment. The stolen kiss was a mistake. It was a mistake that could get them both killed. Chapter 8. Beneath a Sky of Fire. The return to the hospital was a surreal experience for Evelyn. After the adrenaline-fueled escape from Amiens, the whispered conversations, and the stolen kiss with James, the familiar routines of the ward felt strangely alien, almost mundane. The cries of the wounded, the smell of antiseptic, the constant bustle of nurses and doctors, it was all the same, yet everything had changed. She was no longer just a nurse tending to the physical wounds of soldiers. She was a participant in a dangerous game of espionage, a keeper of secrets, a woman walking a tightrope between duty and deception. She went through the motions of her work, checking bandages, administering medication, offering words of comfort. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying her conversation with James, analyzing every detail, searching for clues. She kept a watchful eye on her colleagues, listening for any whispers, any rumors, any hint of suspicion. But everyone seemed preoccupied with their own duties, their own anxieties, their own struggles to cope with the relentless toll of the war. The head doctor, the gruff, battle-hardened veteran who had reluctantly allowed her to accompany the convoy, greeted her with a curt nod. "You're back, Carter," he said, his voice devoid of warmth.
Good. We need all hands on deck.
Another wave of casualties coming in. Evelyn simply nodded, offering a silent acknowledgement. She couldn't tell him the truth, couldn't reveal the real reason for her absence. She had to maintain the facade, to play the role of the dedicated nurse, the woman who was solely focused on caring for the wounded. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every glance, every whisper, every overheard conversation seemed to carry a hidden meaning, a potential threat. She was acutely aware of her own vulnerability, of the danger she was in. She found herself drawn to Captain Calloway's cot, even though she knew he was no longer there. The empty bed was a stark reminder of his absence, of the secret they shared, of the perilous mission they had embarked on. She touched the thin blanket, the indentation where his body had lain, the faint scent of sandalwood that still lingered in the air. It was a tangible connection to him, a reminder of the stolen kiss, the promise they had made. As night fell, the shelling intensified. The hospital shook with each explosion, the windows rattling, the wounded men crying out in fear. The sky above Amiens was lit up with a fiery glow, a terrifying spectacle of destruction. Evelyn sat beside a young soldier, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with terror. He was suffering from severe shell shock, his mind trapped in a nightmare of exploding bombs and screaming men. She held his hand, offering words of comfort, trying to soothe his fears. But her own fears were rising, a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. She was alone, vulnerable, surrounded by danger. Suddenly, she heard a familiar voice, a soft whisper that sent a shiver down her spine. Evelyn, she turned, her heart pounding. It was one of the orderlies, a man she had often seen around the hospital, a quiet, unassuming figure who blended into the background. He looked at her, his eyes dark and intense. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low and urgent. Alone. Evelyn's mind raced. Was he the spy? Was he the one James was looking for? Or was he an ally, a contact, someone who could help her? She hesitated, her instincts warring. Trust no one, James had warned her. But she couldn't afford to dismiss any potential lead, any opportunity to find the list. "All right," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But not here.
Follow me."
She led him to her small, cramped quarters, the same room where she had read James's letter, the room that held the memory of their first, whispered conversation. She closed the door behind them, the small candle on the table casting flickering shadows on the walls. The air was thick with tension, with unspoken questions.
"What is it?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" The orderly looked at her, his expression grim. "I know about Captain Calloway," he said, his voice low and steady. "I know he's not who he seems to be." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. Her worst fears were confirmed. He knew.
But how?
"I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, trying to maintain her composure. The orderly smiled, a cold, unsettling smile. "Don't play games with me, nurse," he said, his voice hardening. "I know he's a spy, and I know you're helping him. He reached beneath his coat, his fingers closing over metal. He was going in for the kill. She realized she had been set up. He had been watching her. Chapter 9. The Confession in the Ruins. Evelyn's mind raced, her body frozen in terror. The orderly's words, his cold smile, the glint of metal beneath his coat, it all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. He was the spy, the one James had been hunting. And he had found her. I don't know what you're talking about, she repeated, her voice trembling, trying desperately to maintain a facade of innocence. But she knew it was futile. He had seen through her, had uncovered her secret. Don't lie to me, nurse, the orderly hissed, his voice menacing. I know Calloway is working for British intelligence, and I know you're his contact. You were seen with him in Amiens, near the clock. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowed, his hand still concealed beneath his coat. Evelyn could feel the cold steel of the wall against her back, the rough texture of the plaster. She was trapped, cornered, with nowhere to run. Tell me where the list is, the orderly demanded, his voice harsh. Tell me where Calloway is hiding, and I might let you live. Evelyn's mind scrambled for a way out, a desperate plan to buy herself time. She knew she couldn't reveal James's location, couldn't betray the mission. But she also knew that her life was in imminent danger. I don't know anything about a list, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper.
I swear.
I was just tending to Captain Calloway. He was wounded. The orderly laughed, a cold, cruel sound that sent chills down her spine. You expect me to believe that? He sneered. You, a simple nurse, caught up in a web of espionage? Don't insult my intelligence. He pulled his hand from beneath his coat, revealing a small, gleaming pistol. He pointed it at Evelyn, his finger tightening on the trigger. Last chance, nurse, he said, his voice deadly. Tell me what I want to know. Or suddenly, a voice interrupted them, a calm, authoritative voice that cut through the tension like a knife. Or what, Deschamps? Both Evelyn and the orderly Deschamps, as he had been called, whirled around. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the flickering light of the ward, was James Calloway. He was holding his own pistol, aimed directly at Deschamps. Relief washed over Evelyn, a wave of warmth that momentarily banished the fear. He had found her. He had come to save her. Deschamps, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock, slowly lowered his pistol. Calloway, he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. But you were dead? James finished, his voice cold and hard. A convenient rumor, I assure you. One I deliberately spread to flush you out. He took a step closer, his eyes fixed on Deschamps, his pistol unwavering. It's over, Deschamps, he said, his voice deadly. You're finished. Your treachery ends here. Deschamps, his bravado crumbling, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape, suddenly lunged towards the window, attempting to break free. James fired a single shot. The bullet struck Deschamps in the leg, sending him crashing to the floor, clutching his wound, crying out in pain. James stood over him, his pistol still aimed, his face a mask of grim determination. Don't even think about it, he said, his voice cold. Evelyn, her legs trembling, her body shaking, watched the scene unfold, her mind struggling to process the sudden shift in power. The man who had moments before been threatening her life was now lying on the floor, wounded and defeated. James turned to her, his eyes softening, his expression shifting from cold fury to concern. Are you all right, Evelyn? He asked, his voice gentle. She nodded, her voice choked with emotion. Yes, I'm fine, she stammered. But how did you know? I had my suspicions about Deschamps for a while, James explained, his voice low. He was always too curious, too eager to please. And he had access to information he shouldn't have had. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. I followed him tonight, he continued. I saw him talking to you. Saw him lead you here. I knew he was up to something. He holstered his pistol, then knelt beside Deschamps, checking his wound. It's not life-threatening, he said, his voice matter-of-fact. But he won't be going anywhere anytime soon. He stood up, then turned back to Evelyn, his eyes searching hers. I'm sorry, Evelyn, he said, his voice sincere. I never meant to put you in danger. I underestimated Desham. I should have been more careful. It's not your fault, Evelyn said, her voice trembling.
You saved my life. You came for me.
He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was warm, reassuring, sending a shiver down her spine. I told you I wouldn't let anything happen to you, he said, his voice soft. He was so close. She felt his breath against her skin. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tentative kiss. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated relief, a connection that transcended the danger, the deception, the war that raged around them. The kiss deepened, but only for a moment. He pulled away, his expression shifting. The list, he said, urgent once more. While he is still awake, we need to find out where he hid the list. Chapter 10. The weight of his past. Desham, his face contorted with pain, his leg bleeding profusely, glared up at James with a mixture of defiance and fear. He was a broken man, his treachery exposed, his life hanging in the balance. But he still clung to a shred of resistance, of refusal to fully surrender. I'll never tell you anything, Calloway, he spat, his voice weak but venomous. You may have caught me, but you'll never find the list. It's gone, destroyed. You've lost. James remained calm, his expression unwavering. He knelt beside Desham, his eyes fixed on his voice low and steady. Don't be a fool, Desham, he said. You're finished. Your game is over. Cooperate and you might still save yourself some pain. He gestured towards Evelyn, who stood watching the scene unfold, her heart still pounding, her mind reeling. This woman, this innocent nurse you threatened to kill, she's the only reason you're still alive, James continued, his voice hardening. I should have shot you dead where you stood. But she asked me to spare you. Desham's eyes flickered towards Evelyn, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even a hint of shame, crossing his features. He had underestimated her, had dismissed her as a mere pawn in his game. But she had shown strength, resilience, a compassion he didn't deserve. James pressed his advantage. Tell me where the list is, Desham, he repeated, his voice insistent. Tell me, and I'll make sure you get a fair trial. You'll have a chance to explain yourself, to defend your actions. Desham hesitated, his resolve wavering. He was trapped, cornered, with no way out. He knew that James was his only hope, his only chance to avoid a summary execution or a slow, agonizing death in a military prison. Finally, with a sigh of resignation, he spoke. It's hidden, he stammered, his voice weak. In the cathedral. The Amiens Cathedral. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The cathedral. The magnificent, ancient structure that dominated the city's skyline. It was a place of worship, a symbol of hope, a sanctuary from the horrors of war. And now it was also a hiding place for a deadly secret. Where in the cathedral? James pressed, his voice urgent. Be specific. Desham hesitated again, his eyes darting around the room, as if searching for an escape, a way to avoid revealing the final piece of the puzzle. But he knew it was futile. He had gone too far, had betrayed too many secrets. Behind the altar, he whispered, his voice barely audible. There's a loose stone. The list is hidden there. James nodded, his expression grim. He had the information he needed. The list, the evidence that could expose the network of spies operating within the British ranks, was within reach. He stood up, then turned to Evelyn, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and determination. We need to go, he said, his voice urgent. We need to get to the cathedral before they realize Desham has been compromised. But before they could leave, Evelyn had a question, something she needed to address. She looked at him, and though she knew it was not the time, her heart would not be silent. James, she asked. Why me? Truly. There had to be others. Operatives. Why ask a simple nurse? He paused. He turned to her and seemed to weigh something heavy and internal. His shoulders sagged, just slightly, and a weariness crossed his features. He looked, for the first time, truly vulnerable. Because you remind me of her, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. He looked away, focusing on a distant spot in the room. Haunted. Her? Evelyn asked, confused. My sister, he said, his voice filled with a deep sadness.
She
was a nurse, too. In Belgium. At the start of the war. He paused and took a ragged breath. The air filled with a memory. She was tending to wounded soldiers, British and German alike. She believed in helping anyone in need, regardless of their uniform. What happened to her? Evelyn asked, soft, gentle. She reached a hand out to touch his arm, offering comfort. He flinched, slightly, but did not pull away. The Germans. They overran the hospital. They accused her of being a spy, of helping the British.
They.
He couldn't finish the sentence, the words caught in his throat. The memory too painful. Evelyn understood. She had seen the brutality of war, the senseless violence, the innocent lives lost. She knew the horrors that could be inflicted, the atrocities that were committed in the name of duty and patriotism. I'm so sorry, James, she whispered. It was not enough. No words were enough to cover such pain. He took a deep breath, composing himself. She was brave.
Strong.
Just like you. He looked at her now, the haunted look receding, replaced by a flicker of something else. A connection. When I saw you, tending to the wounded, so calm, so compassionate. You reminded me of her. I knew I could trust you. I knew you would understand.
He paused.
I needed you, Evelyn. Perhaps. More than you know. He looked as though he might say more, might reveal a deeper truth. But the sound of sirens broke the moment, and the urgency returned. Chapter 11. The Betrayal at Dawn. The wail of air raid sirens pierced the night, a chilling sound that sent a wave of fear through the hospital. The shelling, which had subsided for a few hours, resumed with renewed intensity, shaking the very foundations of the building. James and Evelyn exchanged a look of urgency. They knew they had to move quickly before the cathedral became inaccessible, or worse, before the list was discovered and destroyed. They left Deschamps tied up in Evelyn's quarters, his wound bandaged, his fate uncertain. James had alerted a trusted colleague, a fellow intelligence officer who was stationed nearby, to come and take Deschamps into custody. But they couldn't wait. They had to get to the cathedral. They slipped out of the hospital, avoiding the main thoroughfares, keeping to the shadows. The streets were chaotic, filled with fleeing civilians and soldiers scrambling for cover. The sky above Amiens was ablaze with explosions, the air thick with smoke and dust. As they approached the cathedral, they saw that it had already suffered significant damage. Several shells had struck the ancient structure, leaving gaping holes in the walls, shattering stained glass windows, and scattering debris across the surrounding square. But the main structure, the towering spire, the massive stone walls, still stood, a testament to centuries of faith and resilience. It was a beacon of hope in a city consumed by destruction. They made their way through the rubble-strewn square, their hearts pounding, their senses alert. They could hear the sounds of gunfire and explosions all around them, a constant reminder of the danger they were in. They reached the main entrance of the cathedral, a massive wooden door that was miraculously still intact. James tried the handle, but it was locked. He pulled out a small set of tools from his pocket and began to work on the lock, his movements deft and precise. Evelyn stood guard, her eyes scanning the surrounding area, her senses on high alert. She felt a growing sense of unease, a premonition that something was wrong. Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her. A footstep, the crunch of gravel. She whirled around, her heart in her throat. A figure emerged from the shadows. A man, tall and imposing, wearing the uniform of a British officer. But it wasn't James. It was Major Alistair Finch, James's superior officer, the man who had recruited him into the intelligence unit, the man James trusted above all others. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Something was terribly wrong. Finch's presence here, at this hour, in this place, it didn't make sense. Major Finch, she stammered, her voice trembling. What are you doing here? Finch smiled, a cold, cruel smile that sent chills down her spine. Looking for you, my dear, he said, his voice smooth and menacing. And for your friend, Captain Calloway. He took a step closer, his eyes fixed on hers, his hand moving towards his holster. Evelyn knew, with a sickening certainty, that he was the traitor, the one who had been betraying secrets to the Germans, the one James had been hunting. You, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You're the spy. Finch laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the deserted square. Very good, nurse, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You're quicker than I thought. But it's too late. Far too late. He drew his pistol, aiming it at Evelyn. Tell me where Calloway is, he demanded, his voice harsh. Tell me where the list is, and I might let you live. Before Evelyn could respond, James emerged from the cathedral, the door finally unlocked. He saw Finch, saw the pistol aimed at Evelyn, and his face hardened with fury. Finch! He shouted, his voice filled with rage. You treacherous bastard. Finch turned, his pistol swinging towards James. Ah, Calloway, he said, his voice cold. I was wondering when you'd show up. The two men faced each other, their pistols drawn, their eyes locked in a deadly standoff. The air was thick with tension, with the unspoken threat of violence. It was you, James said, his voice low and deadly. All along it was you. You betrayed us, Finch. You betrayed your country. Your men, you betrayed me. Finch shrugged, his expression nonchalant. Sentimentality, Calloway, he said, his voice dismissive. It's a weakness. I chose the winning side. The side with the power, the money, the future. You're a disgrace, James spat, his voice filled with contempt. And you're a fool, Finch retorted. A naive idealist, blinded by your loyalty, your sense of duty. He raised his pistol, his finger tightening on the trigger. Goodbye, Calloway, he said, his voice cold. Suddenly, Evelyn, driven by a surge of adrenaline, a desperate act of courage, lunged forward, knocking Finch's arm aside just as he fired. The bullet went wild, shattering a nearby window. James seized the opportunity, tackling Finch to the ground, his pistol flying from his hand. The two men grappled, wrestling for control, their bodies locked in a brutal struggle. Evelyn, her heart pounding, her body trembling, watched the fight unfold, her mind racing. She had to help James, had to do something. She saw Finch's pistol lying on the ground, just a few feet away. She scrambled towards it, her fingers closing around the cold metal. She raised the pistol, aiming it at Finch, her hand shaking. She had never fired a gun before, had never even held one. But she knew she had to do it, had to protect James, had to stop the traitor. The dawn was breaking. In that light, before she could act, before James could stop him, Finch pulled a small, hidden knife. It was over in a moment. Finch had struck. James slumped. Chapter 12. The Price of Loyalty. Evelyn screamed, a primal sound of anguish and terror that echoed through the deserted square. She watched in horror as James, her James, slumped to the ground, his body convulsing, Finch's knife protruding from his side. Finch, his face contorted with a mixture of triumph and desperation, scrambled to his feet, his eyes fixed on Evelyn. He knew she was the only witness, the only one who could expose him. You, he spat, his voice ragged, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. You should have stayed out of it, nurse. He lunged towards her, the knife still clutched in his hand, his intention clear. He was going to silence her, to eliminate the last obstacle to his escape. But Evelyn, fueled by a surge of adrenaline, a desperate instinct for survival, reacted without thinking. She raised the pistol, her hand shaking, her finger tightening on the trigger. She fired. The shot echoed through the square, a deafening sound that seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of the cathedral. Finch staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock, his hand clutching at his chest. He looked down at the spreading stain of blood on his uniform, his expression a mixture of disbelief and horror. He had been so close to victory, to escaping with his secrets intact. And now he crumpled to the ground, his body lifeless, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. The traitor was dead. Evelyn lowered the pistol, her hand trembling uncontrollably, her body shaking with the aftermath of the violent encounter. She had killed a man. She, a nurse, a woman dedicated to saving lives, had taken one. But she had no time for remorse, no time for regret. James was lying on the ground, bleeding, his life hanging in the balance. She rushed to his side, kneeling beside him, her heart pounding with fear. She gently touched his face, his skin cold and clammy, his breathing shallow and ragged. "James," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "James, can you hear me?" He opened his eyes, his gaze unfocused, his expression pained. He tried to speak, but only a faint whisper escaped his lips. "Evelyn, don't talk," she said, her voice urgent. "Save your strength. I'll get you help." She tore a strip of cloth from her uniform, pressing it against the wound in his side, trying to stem the flow of blood. But it was deep. The knife had pierced a vital organ. She knew she had to get him back to the hospital, to the doctors, to the operating room. But he was too heavy for her to carry alone, and the streets were still dangerous, filled with the chaos of the ongoing battle. She looked around desperately, searching for help, for someone, anyone, who could assist her. But the square was deserted, the only sounds the distant rumble of artillery and the cries of gulls overhead. She was alone, with a dying man and a dead traitor, in the shadow of a war-torn cathedral. She cradled James's head in her lap, her tears falling onto his face, mixing with the blood that stained his uniform. She whispered words of comfort, of encouragement, of love, a desperate plea for him to hold on, to fight for his life. "Please, James," she murmured, her voice breaking.
Please don't leave me.
"I need you. We have so much to live for." He squeezed her hand weakly, his eyes flickering open, his gaze meeting hers. He tried to smile, a faint, fleeting expression that tore at her heart. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The list, she remembered the list, the vital piece of evidence that could expose the network of spies, the reason for all the danger, all the sacrifice. "Don't worry about the list," she said, her voice urgent. "Just focus on getting better. We'll find it, I promise." "No," he whispered, his voice weaker now. Behind the altar-loose stone, he closed his eyes, his breathing becoming shallower, his grip on her hand loosening. Evelyn knew, with a sickening certainty, that he was slipping away, that the life was draining out of him. She held him close, her body shaking with sobs, her heart breaking with a grief so profound, so overwhelming, that it threatened to consume her. "I love you, James," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I love you so much." His hand went limp in hers. His breathing stopped. He was gone. Evelyn sat there, in the ruins of a city at war, holding the body of the man she loved, the man who had shown her courage and resilience and the possibility of a future beyond the horrors of the battlefield. A future that was now lost forever. A debt that must be paid. Chapter 13. Echoes of Lost Voices. The silence that followed James's death was deafening, broken only by Evelyn's sobs and the distant rumble of war. The dawn, which had begun with a glimmer of hope, had turned into a nightmare, a scene of devastation and loss. She remained there for a long time, cradling James's body, unable to accept the reality of his death, unwilling to let go of the man who had changed her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. The world around her seemed to fade, the sounds of battle, the ruins of the city, the presence of Finch's lifeless body, it all blurred into a haze of grief and despair. She was lost in a sea of sorrow, adrift in a world that had suddenly become cold and empty. She had found love, a love that had blossomed in the midst of war, a love that had defied the odds, a love that had promised a future, and now it was gone, snatched away by the cruel hand of fate. Eventually, the sound of approaching footsteps broke through her grief. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen, her face streaked with tears. A group of British soldiers, led by the intelligence officer James had contacted, were approaching the square. They had come for Desham, but they found a scene far more tragic than they had anticipated. They saw Evelyn, kneeling beside James's body, her uniform stained with blood, her expression one of utter devastation. They saw Finch's lifeless body lying nearby, the pistol still clutched in Evelyn's hand. The intelligence officer, a man named Captain Davies, recognized Evelyn from the hospital. He had known James, had worked with him on several operations. He understood, with a sickening certainty, what had happened. He approached Evelyn cautiously, his voice gentle, his expression filled with compassion. "Nurse Carter," he said softly, "what happened here?" Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes filled with a pain so profound, so raw, that it made his heart ache. She couldn't speak, couldn't form the words to describe the horror she had witnessed, the loss she had suffered. She simply pointed to James's body, then to Finch's, her tears flowing freely. Davies understood. He knelt beside James, checking for a pulse, knowing it was futile. He closed James's eyes, a gesture of respect, of farewell. He then turned his attention to Evelyn, his concern deepening. She was in shock, traumatized by the events that had unfolded. He needed to get her to safety, to get her medical attention. "Nurse Carter," he said gently, "we need to go. We need to get you out of here." Evelyn didn't resist, didn't protest. She allowed herself to be led away, her body numb, her mind blank. She was a shell of her former self, a woman broken by grief, by loss, by the brutal reality of war. The soldiers carried James's body, wrapping it in a blanket, treating it with reverence and respect. They took Finch's body as well, a grim reminder of the treachery that had cost so many lives. As they left the square, Evelyn looked back at the cathedral, its damaged spire silhouetted against the morning sky. It was a place of sanctuary, a place of hope, a place where she had found love and lost it, all in the span of a few terrifying hours. She remembered James's last words, his whispered instructions about the list. Behind the altar loose stone, she knew she had to find it, had to fulfill his mission, had to honor his sacrifice. But for now, all she could feel was the emptiness, the void that his death had left in her heart. The echoes of lost voices. The silent screams. They took her back to the hospital, a place that had once been her refuge, her sanctuary. But now, it felt like a prison, a reminder of everything she had lost. The head doctor, the gruff, battle-hardened veteran, saw her condition and immediately ordered her to be sedated. She didn't fight it, didn't protest. She welcomed the oblivion, the temporary escape from the pain. As she drifted off to sleep, she heard voices, whispers, fragments of conversations. She heard James's voice, his laughter, his words of encouragement, his promise of a future. She felt his touch, his kiss, his embrace. But they were just echoes, ghosts of a love that was gone, a love that would never be. She was alone, adrift in a world of sorrow, a world where the only certainty was loss. She did not know how she could go on. She did not know if she had the strength. But a small ember still burned. She remembered her vow. Chapter 14. The Scars That Bind Us. The days that followed were a blur of grief and numbness. Evelyn moved through the hospital like a ghost, her body going through the motions of her duties, her mind lost in a haze of sorrow. She was haunted by James's death, by the memory of his lifeless body, by the sound of his last breath. She replayed the events in the square over and over again, the confrontation with Finch, the desperate struggle, the fatal shot. She was plagued by guilt, by the feeling that she could have done more, that she could have saved him. She had killed Finch, had taken a life to protect James, but it hadn't been enough. He was gone, and she was left with the unbearable weight of his loss. The other nurses, the doctors, the patients, they all treated her with a mixture of sympathy and distance. They knew something terrible had happened, but they didn't know the full story. They couldn't understand the depth of her pain, the emptiness that consumed her. She avoided Captain Davies, the intelligence officer who had come to the square. He had tried to talk to her, to offer his condolences, to ask about the events that had transpired. But she couldn't face him, couldn't relive the horror, couldn't speak of James's death. She received a letter from James's parents, expressing their grief, their gratitude for her care of their son. They had been informed of his heroic death in the line of duty, a sanitized version of the truth that hid the treachery, the betrayal, the real cost of his sacrifice. Evelyn couldn't bring herself to reply. She couldn't bear to write the words, to acknowledge the reality of his death, to offer condolences that felt hollow and meaningless. She kept the letter, along with a few other mementos she had of James, the letter he had written to her, the one that had started it all, a small, silver locket he had given her, containing a miniature portrait of his sister, the nurse who had inspired his mission. These were her treasures, her tangible connections to a love that was gone, a love that would forever be etched in her heart. They were reminders of the scars that bound them, the scars of war, of loss, of a love that had defied the odds, but ultimately succumbed to the brutal reality of their world. One evening, as she sat alone in her small, cramped quarters, the familiar sounds of the hospital swirling around her, she finally opened James's letter again. She had read it countless times before, but now, after his death, the words took on a new meaning, a deeper significance. "You are the key, the only one who can unlock the truth and prevent a catastrophe," his words echoed in her mind, a reminder of the mission he had entrusted to her, the responsibility he had placed on her shoulders. He had believed in her, had trusted her, had loved her, and she couldn't let him down. She remembered his last words, his whispered instructions about the list. Behind the altar loose stone, she knew she had to find it, had to fulfill his mission, had to honor his sacrifice. It was the only way she could find peace, the only way she could make sense of his death, the only way she could keep his memory alive. She resolved to return to the cathedral, to search for the list, to expose the network of spies that had cost so many lives, including James's. It was a dangerous undertaking, a risk she was willing to take. She had nothing left to lose. The next morning, she informed the head doctor that she needed to take a few days of leave. She cited personal reasons, a vague explanation that he didn't question. He knew she had been through a traumatic experience, and he granted her request without hesitation. She packed a small bag, taking only the essentials: a change of clothes, some food, a first aid kit, and James's locket. She also took the pistol she had used to kill Finch, a grim reminder of the violence she had witnessed, the life she had taken. She left the hospital, walking away from the familiar routines, the comforting presence of her colleagues, the safety of her surroundings. She was venturing into the unknown, into a world of danger and uncertainty, driven by a sense of duty, of loyalty, of love. As she walked, she felt a strange sense of calm, a sense of purpose. She was no longer just a nurse, a woman grieving the loss of her love. She was a warrior, a fighter, a woman on a mission. She was going to find the list. She was going to expose the traitors. She was going to avenge James's death. She was going to honor the scars that bound them. She walked with her head held high, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her heart filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. She was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, ready to fight for the truth, for justice, for the memory of the man she loved. She felt him with her, guiding her, even now. Chapter 15. A glimmer of hope in the darkness. The journey back to the Amiens Cathedral was fraught with peril. The city was still under siege, the streets a battleground, the air thick with smoke and the sounds of war. Evelyn moved cautiously, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the main thoroughfares, her senses on high alert. She encountered scenes of devastation and despair: buildings reduced to rubble, streets littered with debris, the bodies of soldiers and civilians lying where they had fallen. The war had taken its toll, leaving a scar on the city, on its people, on her own soul. But amidst the destruction, she also witnessed acts of resilience, of courage, of compassion. She saw soldiers helping wounded comrades, civilians sharing their meager rations, nurses tending to the injured with unwavering dedication. These glimpses of humanity, of hope in the darkness, strengthened her resolve, reminding her of the values James had fought for, the ideals he had believed in. She was carrying his torch, continuing his mission, fighting for a better future, a future free from treachery and violence. When she finally reached the cathedral, she found it even more damaged than before. Another shell had struck the building, collapsing part of the roof, scattering debris across the floor. The once magnificent stained glass windows were now shattered fragments, their vibrant colors dulled by dust and grime. But the altar, miraculously, was still intact. The massive stone structure, adorned with intricate carvings and religious symbols, stood firm, a testament to centuries of faith and resilience. It was a beacon of hope in a sea of destruction. Evelyn approached the altar, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert. She remembered James's whispered instructions. Behind the altar loose stone, she ran her hands along the cold, smooth surface of the stone, searching for any sign of a loose panel, a hidden compartment, a secret passage. She felt the intricate carvings, the detailed depictions of biblical scenes, the symbols of faith and hope. She circled the altar, examining every inch of its surface, her fingers probing every crevice, every joint, every seam. She found nothing. Disappointment washed over her, a wave of despair threatening to engulf her. Had she come all this way for nothing? Was the list a figment of James's dying imagination? She refused to give up. She had promised him, had vowed to fulfill his mission, to honor his sacrifice. She would not fail him. She started again, her fingers tracing the outline of the altar, her eyes scanning the surface, her mind focused on the task at hand. She had to find it. She had to. Then, as her fingers brushed against a seemingly solid section of stone, she felt it. A slight movement, a subtle shift, a barely perceptible give. She pressed harder, and the stone panel slid inward, revealing a small, dark cavity behind the altar. Her heart leaped with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. She had found it. She reached into the cavity, her fingers closing around a small, leather-bound package. She pulled it out, her hand trembling, her breath catching in her throat.
It was the list.
She opened the package, her eyes scanning the neatly written names, the detailed information, the evidence of treachery and betrayal that James had risked his life to obtain. She recognized some of the names: high-ranking officers, influential politicians, individuals who held positions of power and trust. They were the enemy within, the traitors who had been undermining the war effort, costing countless lives. She felt a surge of anger, of outrage, of a burning desire for justice. These men, these traitors, would be brought to account. James's sacrifice would not be in vain. But as she looked at the list, she also noticed something else. A small, folded piece of paper tucked inside the leather binding. She unfolded it, her heart pounding. It was a letter addressed to her, in James's handwriting. "My dearest Evelyn, if you are reading this, then I have failed. I have failed in my mission, and I have failed you. But I know you will not fail. You are strong, you are brave, you are the key. I knew the risks I was taking, Evelyn. I knew that my life was in danger. But I believed in the cause, in the fight for freedom, for justice, for a better world. I also believed in you. I saw your strength, your compassion, your unwavering spirit. I knew you were the one who could carry on, who could finish what I started. I love you, Evelyn. I love you more than words can say. And I will always be with you, in your heart, in your memory, in the fight for a better future. With all my love, and a hope that will never die." James' tears streamed down Evelyn's face as she read the letter, her heart aching with a mixture of grief and love. He had known, had anticipated his death, had prepared for this moment. And he had entrusted her with his final message, his last declaration of love. A glimmer of hope sparked within her, a flicker of warmth in the darkness. She was not alone. James's spirit lived on, in her heart, in her memory, in the mission she was now carrying forward. He had always known. She carefully folded the letter, placing it back inside the leather binding, along with the list. She would deliver it to Captain Davies, the intelligence officer, the one James had trusted. She would expose the traitors, bring them to justice, and honor James's sacrifice. She stood up, her resolve strengthened, her heart filled with a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just a nurse, a woman grieving the loss of her love. She was a warrior, a fighter, a woman on a mission. The end was in sight. Chapter 16. The Train to Nowhere. Evelyn left the cathedral, the list and James's letter safely concealed beneath her coat. She felt a strange mix of emotions: relief at having found the list, sorrow at James's death, determination to see his mission through to the end. She knew she had to get to Captain Davies, the intelligence officer, as quickly as possible. But Amiens was still a war zone, the streets dangerous, the risk of capture or worse ever present. She decided to head for the railway station, hoping to catch a train out of the city. It was a risky move, as the station was likely to be heavily guarded, but it was the fastest way to reach safety and deliver the evidence. As she approached the station, she saw that it was a scene of chaos. Crowds of refugees were clamoring to board trains, desperate to escape the fighting. Soldiers were patrolling the platforms, checking papers, searching for spies and deserters. Evelyn blended in with the crowd, keeping her head down, her eyes averted. She clutched the list and the letter close to her chest, her heart pounding with fear and anticipation. She managed to slip past the guards, boarding a train that was already overcrowded with passengers. She found a small space in a corner of a carriage, squeezing herself between a group of women and children. The train slowly pulled out of the station, gathering speed as it headed away from Amiens, away from the battle, away from the memories of loss and love. Evelyn looked out the window, watching the war-torn landscape pass by. The fields were scarred with trenches and craters, the trees stripped bare, the buildings reduced to rubble. It was a scene of devastation, a testament to the destructive power of war. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the images, trying to find some solace in the darkness. But the memories of James, of their brief time together, of his love and sacrifice, flooded her mind. She felt a tear roll down her cheek, a silent tribute to the man she had lost, the man who had changed her life forever. She would never forget him, would never forget his courage, his compassion, his unwavering spirit. As the train rumbled on, she began to feel a growing sense of unease. Something wasn't right. The train was moving too slowly, too erratically. It wasn't following the usual route. She looked around the carriage, noticing that the other passengers seemed equally apprehensive. They were whispering among themselves, their faces etched with fear and confusion. Suddenly, the train screeched to a halt, throwing the passengers forward. There were shouts, screams, the sound of boots running along the tracks. Evelyn's heart leaped into her throat. What was happening? Had they been captured? Was this the end? The door to the carriage was flung open, and a group of soldiers stormed in, their weapons drawn. But they weren't British soldiers. They were German. Evelyn's blood ran cold. They had been betrayed. The train had been diverted, deliberately sent into enemy territory. The soldiers began to herd the passengers out of the carriage, shouting orders in German, their faces grim, their eyes hard. Evelyn knew she had to do something, had to protect the list, had to escape. She looked around desperately, searching for a way out, a chance to slip away. But the soldiers were everywhere, their eyes watchful, their weapons ready. As she was being pushed out of the carriage, she saw her opportunity. A small window, slightly ajar, near the back of the train. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was her only hope. She waited for the right moment. Then, with a surge of adrenaline, she broke free from the crowd, ducking down and scrambling towards the window. She squeezed through the narrow opening, dropping to the ground outside the train. She landed hard, twisting her ankle, but she ignored the pain, scrambling to her feet and running. She ran as fast as she could, away from the train, away from the soldiers, away from the danger. She didn't know where she was going, didn't know where she was, but she knew she had to keep moving, had to escape. She heard shouts behind her, the sound of gunfire. The soldiers had seen her, were pursuing her. She had to find somewhere to hide, somewhere to conceal herself. This train was heading to nowhere, and she was trapped. Chapter 17. The Secrets of the Chateau. Evelyn ran blindly through the unfamiliar countryside, her lungs burning, her legs aching, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind her. She knew she couldn't outrun the soldiers, couldn't escape on her own. She needed to find shelter, a place to hide, a place to regroup. As she stumbled through a field of tall grass, she saw it in the distance. A chateau, a large, imposing building, its walls silhouetted against the twilight sky. It was a risky choice, a potential haven or a deadly trap, but she had no other options. She made her way towards the chateau, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert. The building was old, its stone walls weathered and worn, its windows dark and empty. It seemed deserted, abandoned, a relic of a bygone era. She reached the main entrance, a massive wooden door, its iron hinges rusted and creaking. She tried the handle, but it was locked. She looked around desperately, searching for another way in. She found a small, side door, partially hidden by overgrown vines. She tried the handle, and to her surprise, it opened. She slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. She found herself in a dimly lit hallway, the air thick with dust and the smell of decay. The chateau was clearly uninhabited, its once grand interior now neglected and crumbling. She moved cautiously, her footsteps echoing through the silent halls. She passed through large, empty rooms, their walls adorned with faded tapestries and peeling paint, their floors covered in a thick layer of dust. She found a grand staircase, its ornate banister cracked and broken, its steps worn and uneven. She climbed the stairs, her hand trailing along the smooth, cold stone. She reached the upper floor, finding a series of bedrooms, their doors ajar, their furnishings shrouded in white sheets. The air was colder here, the silence more profound. She chose a room at the end of the hallway, its window overlooking a neglected garden. She closed the door, leaning against it, her body trembling, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps.
She was safe for now.
But she knew she couldn't stay here long. The soldiers would be searching for her, and the chateau was an obvious place to look. She needed to find a way to contact Captain Davies, to deliver the list, to expose the traitors. But she was stranded, alone, in enemy territory, with no means of communication. As she sat on the edge of a dusty bed, her mind racing, she noticed a small, wooden desk in the corner of the room. She approached it, her heart quickening with a flicker of hope. She opened the drawers, finding them filled with old papers, letters, documents. Most of them were in French, a language she understood only vaguely. But then, she found something that made her heart leap. A small, leather-bound book, its cover embossed with a familiar symbol, the crest of the British intelligence unit. She opened the book, her fingers trembling. It was a code book containing a series of ciphers, keys, and instructions for secret communication. She realized, with a surge of excitement, that the chateau must have been a safe house, a secret meeting place for British intelligence operatives. And James, somehow, must have known about it. She searched the room further, finding a hidden compartment behind a loose panel in the wall. Inside, she discovered a wireless transmitter, a sophisticated piece of equipment used for sending coded messages. She knew how to operate it, having received basic training at the hospital. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was her only hope of contacting Captain Davies. She set up the transmitter, carefully connecting the wires, adjusting the dials, her hands moving with a newfound confidence. She tapped out a message, using the code book to encrypt her words, sending a desperate plea for help. She waited, her heart pounding, her ears straining for a response. The silence stretched on, broken only by the creaking of the old house and the distant sounds of war. Then finally she heard it. A faint crackle, a series of clicks, a coded message coming through the ether. It was Captain Davies. He had received her message. He was coming. He was bringing help. She can communicate the details of the list. Relief washed over Evelyn. Chapter 18. The Reckoning of Hearts. Evelyn waited anxiously in the chateau, the wireless transmitter her only link to the outside world, the list her only weapon against the enemy. She had sent Captain Davies the details of the list, the names of the traitors, the evidence of their betrayal. Now, all she could do was wait and hope. The hours passed slowly, each minute an eternity. The chateau was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old building and the distant rumble of artillery fire. The darkness deepened, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. Evelyn paced the room, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She was trapped, isolated, vulnerable. But she was not defeated. She had come too far, had sacrificed too much, to give up now. She thought of James, of his courage, his compassion, his unwavering belief in her. She remembered his smile, his touch, his last words of love. He was her inspiration, her strength, her guiding light. She knew he would want her to be strong, to be brave, to see this mission through to the end. She would not let him down. She would fight for justice, for truth, for the memory of the man she loved. As dawn approached, she heard it. The sound of vehicles approaching the chateau. Her heart leaped with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Was it Captain Davies? Or was it the enemy? She peered out the window, her eyes straining to see through the dim light. She saw a convoy of British military vehicles, their headlights cutting through the darkness, their engines rumbling. It was them. They had come. She rushed downstairs, her heart pounding with relief. She flung open the side door, stepping out into the cold morning air. Captain Davies emerged from the lead vehicle, his face grim, his eyes scanning the surroundings. He saw Evelyn, and a flicker of relief crossed his features. "Nurse Carter," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she replied, her voice trembling.
I'm fine.
"But the list we have it," Davies assured her. "We received your message. The traitors have been arrested. Their network is being dismantled." Evelyn felt a wave of relief wash over her, a sense of closure, of justice served. James's mission had been accomplished. His sacrifice had not been in vain. But the victory felt hollow, bittersweet. James was gone, and nothing could bring him back. The pain of his loss was still raw, the wound in her heart still fresh. I found something else," she said, her voice hesitant. "In the chateau. A letter. From James." She handed Davies the letter, the one James had written to her, the one that had revealed his love, his fears, his hopes for the future. Davies took the letter, his expression softening. He knew about James's feelings for Evelyn, had witnessed their connection, their unspoken bond. He read the letter, his eyes moistening, his heart aching for the loss of his friend, his colleague, his brother in arms. "He loved you, Evelyn," Davies said softly. "He truly loved you." Evelyn nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know," she whispered. "And I loved him." They stood there for a moment, in silence, sharing their grief, their memories, their respect for the man they had both lost. The war raged on around them, but in that moment, all that mattered was the love, the loss, the legacy of James Calloway. Davies then took her gently by the arm. He explained that he had arranged passage back to England for her. A quiet place to recover, to heal. As she began to walk toward the vehicle, Davies stopped her. "There's one more thing, Evelyn," he said carefully. She looked up at him, questioning. He held something out toward her. A small, familiar, leather-bound book. The code book from the chateau. She recognized it instantly. "I don't understand," she began. He opened it to a page she had not seen. Inside, inscribed with a date from only days before James had been admitted to the hospital, was a name and an address. "James arranged this. For you. He knew you would need a safe place. A fresh start."
He paused.
He had prepared for the possibility that he wouldn't survive. Evelyn stared at the name. Mrs. Eleanor Calloway. James's mother. He was trying to take care of her even then. Even from beyond. She realized he had left her a final message. One of hope. Of a future. "It won't be easy," Davies said, his voice filled with a wisdom beyond the battles. "But you aren't alone. You have people who care about you, who will help you." He paused and said the most important words of all. "He would have wanted you to live, Evelyn. Truly live." The reckoning of their hearts was complete. Duty, love, war, and loss. It had all led to this. to a new beginning, a fragile hope. It would be more than enough to start. Chapter 19. The Last Stand. Evelyn's journey back to England was a blur of emotions. The relief of escaping the war-torn landscape of France was tempered by the lingering grief over James's death and the daunting prospect of facing his mother. The address in the code book felt like both a lifeline and a heavy weight. The ship crossing the channel was crowded with returning soldiers, wounded men, and displaced civilians. Evelyn found a quiet corner on the deck, gazing out at the choppy gray waters, her thoughts a turbulent mix of sorrow, gratitude, and uncertainty. She clutched the small, silver locket James had given her, the one containing the miniature portrait of his sister. It was a tangible reminder of his love, his sacrifice, and the connection they had shared, a connection that transcended even death. She remembered his words, his whispered promises, his unwavering belief in her. He had entrusted her with his mission, his secrets, his heart. And she had fulfilled that trust, had honored his memory, had brought the traitors to justice. But the victory felt empty without him. The future he had envisioned, the life they had dreamed of, was now a shattered dream, a path she would have to walk alone. As the ship docked in England, Evelyn felt a surge of trepidation. She was stepping into a new world, a world without James, a world where she would have to forge her own path, to find her own purpose. She made her way to the address in the code book, a small, quaint cottage in a quiet village, far from the bustling city, far from the reminders of war. It was a haven, a sanctuary, a place where she hoped to find some measure of peace, some solace for her grieving heart. As she approached the cottage, she saw a woman standing in the garden, tending to a small patch of flowers. It was Eleanor Calloway, James's mother. Evelyn hesitated, her heart pounding, her hands trembling. How would she face this woman, the mother of the man she had loved, the man who had died in her arms? Eleanor looked up, her eyes meeting Evelyn's. She was an older woman, her face lined with worry and sorrow, but her eyes held a warmth, a kindness, a gentle strength. Evelyn approached her, her voice trembling. "Mrs. Calloway?"
she said softly.
Eleanor nodded, her eyes searching Evelyn's face, recognizing something familiar, something that connected them. "You're Evelyn," she said, her voice gentle.
"James told me about you."
Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes, tears of grief, of gratitude, of relief. She had been afraid, uncertain, but now, standing before this woman, she felt a sense of connection, a sense of belonging. I was with him," Evelyn said, her voice choked with emotion. At the end, Eleanor nodded, her eyes filled with understanding, with shared sorrow. "He loved you, Evelyn," she said softly. "He told me everything." They embraced, two women bound by grief, by loss, by the love of a man who had touched their lives in profound ways. It was a moment of healing, of connection, of shared understanding. Eleanor led Evelyn into the cottage, a cozy, welcoming space filled with warmth and light. It was a home, a sanctuary, a place where Evelyn could begin to heal, to rebuild her life. Over the following days, Evelyn and Eleanor shared their stories, their memories of James, their grief and their hope. They found solace in each other's company, a bond forged by loss, strengthened by love. Eleanor showed Evelyn photographs of James, letters he had written, mementos of his life. She spoke of his childhood, his dreams, his unwavering sense of duty and honor. Evelyn, in turn, shared her experiences with James, their brief but intense time together, their shared mission, their love that had blossomed in the midst of war. They visited the local church, a small, ancient building with a peaceful graveyard. They stood before a newly erected memorial stone, bearing James's name, his rank, his dates of birth and death. "He would have wanted you to live, Evelyn," Eleanor said softly, her hand resting on Evelyn's shoulder. "To find happiness, to build a new life." Evelyn nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. She would honor James's memory, would carry his love with her always, but she would also live, would embrace the future, would find her own path. It was not the ending she had envisioned, Not the life she had dreamed of, but it was a new beginning, a chance to heal, to grow, to find purpose in a world that had been shattered by war. She had made her last stand, and though the battle was long, she was at peace. James, in his way, had brought her home. Chapter 20. A future forged in fire. Years passed. The war ended, leaving behind a world scarred by loss and devastation, but also filled with a renewed sense of hope, a determination to build a better future. Evelyn remained in the quiet village, living with Eleanor, the two women forming a bond that transcended their shared grief, becoming a family forged in the crucible of war. They created a life together, a life filled with simple pleasures, with shared memories, with a quiet strength that came from having survived the unimaginable. Evelyn found work as a nurse in the local village, tending to the needs of the community, using her skills and compassion to heal the wounds of both body and soul. She found solace in her work, a purpose in helping others, a way to honor James's memory by living a life of service. Eleanor, in turn, found comfort in Evelyn's presence, a daughter she had gained through loss, a companion to share her days, a source of strength and love. They often spoke of James, keeping his memory alive, sharing stories of his courage, his humor, his unwavering spirit. They visited his memorial stone regularly, placing flowers, tending to the small plot of land that held his name, a symbol of his sacrifice. Evelyn never forgot James, never stopped loving him. He remained a part of her, a presence in her heart, a guiding light in her life. But she also learned to live again, to embrace the future, to find joy in the simple moments, to build a new life on the foundations of the old. She found love again, a different kind of love, a love that was gentle and patient, a love that understood her past, her scars, her enduring connection to James. She married a local doctor, a kind and compassionate man who had also served in the war, who understood the toll it had taken, the wounds it had left behind. They built a life together, a life filled with love, with family, with a shared commitment to healing and helping others. Evelyn had children, a son and a daughter, whom she named James and Eleanor, in honor of the two people who had shaped her life in profound ways. She told them stories of their namesake, of his courage, his sacrifice, his love. She taught them the values James had lived by, the importance of duty, of honor, of compassion, of fighting for what is right, even in the face of adversity. As the years turned into decades, Evelyn became a pillar of the community, a respected figure, a woman who had lived through war and loss, who had emerged stronger, wiser, more compassionate. She often visited the local school, sharing her experiences with the children, telling them stories of the war, of the sacrifices that had been made, of the importance of peace and understanding. She became a living testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a symbol of hope in a world that had been scarred by conflict, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, love and compassion can endure. She lived a long and full life, a life forged in fire, tempered by loss, strengthened by love. She never forgot James, never stopped cherishing his memory, but she also embraced the future, creating a legacy of healing, of service, of unwavering hope. She had found her peace, her purpose, her place in the world. She had honored James's memory, had fulfilled his trust, had built a life worthy of his sacrifice. It was a future he had envisioned, a future she had created, a future forged in the fires of war, tempered by the enduring power of love. And as her own life drew to a close, she held that truth, firm and warm within her. She was ready.
Epilogue.
The autumn leaves fell softly, swirling around the small, stone church, their colors a vibrant tapestry of red, gold, and brown. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, a familiar fragrance that evoked memories of years gone by. Inside the church, a small gathering of people stood, their faces etched with a mixture of sorrow and remembrance. They had come to pay their respects, to say farewell, to honor the life of a woman who had touched their lives in profound ways. Evelyn Carter Evelyn Thompson, as she had become lay at peace, her hands folded, her face serene, a faint smile playing on her lips. She had lived a long and full life, a life marked by both tragedy and triumph, a life that had spanned nearly a century. Her children, James and Eleanor, stood beside her casket, their own children gathered around them, a testament to the legacy she had created, the family she had built, the love she had shared. They spoke of her kindness, her compassion, her unwavering strength, her resilience in the face of adversity. They shared stories of her life, of her experiences during the war, of her love for James Calloway, of her dedication to healing and helping others. They spoke of the woman she had been, the mother, the grandmother, the friend, the nurse, the warrior, the survivor. They spoke of the life she had lived, the lives she had touched, the legacy she had left behind. As the service ended, the mourners filed out of the church, their hearts filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. They had lost a dear friend, a beloved family member, a woman who had inspired them with her courage, her compassion, her unwavering spirit. James and Eleanor lingered, standing beside their mother's casket, their hands resting on the smooth, polished wood. They felt a profound sense of loss, but also a deep sense of gratitude, of pride, of love. "She lived a good life, didn't she?" Eleanor said softly, her voice choked with emotion. "She did," James replied, his voice firm, his eyes filled with tears. "She lived a life worthy of him." They knew their mother was at peace, reunited with the man she had loved, the man who had shaped her life in so many ways. They knew that her spirit would live on, in their hearts, in their memories, in the legacy she had created. As they turned to leave, the sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of the church, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the floor, illuminating the space with a warm, ethereal glow. It was a reminder of the beauty that still existed in the world, the hope that endured, even in the face of loss, the love that transcended even death. Evelyn's journey was over, but her story would continue, passed down through generations, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the enduring power of love, the future that had been forged in the fires of war. She was home.
At last.